All right, how's it going? Today we are going to finish out our training intelligence webinar series with the third installment, which is all about how we are applying the QT2 block periodization model to real athletes. So, again, what is the QT 2.0 block periodization model? It is a structured, flexible, and data-driven decision-making framework. In the first couple of webinars, we learned how to understand the power of the QT 2.0 block periodization model. We wanted to understand the aim and purpose of each block type, and we wanted to see how default seasonal maps are built. Today, we will finish out this and we'll talk about understanding the role of physiological testing in the decision-making framework, differentiating physiological and practical block decisions, and applying decision-making logic to real athletes, which will be the primary purpose of today. So we went over this last time, but this is just a sample Ironman standard progression, which which if we can utilize it's kind of a one size fits all approach. It's not always the best approach, but it will typically not be the wrong answer, say. And this would take us through the different kind of block types in a standard progression, usually about 8 weeks of base durability training, 6 weeks of build threshold training, 3 weeks of VO2 max training, 5 weeks of specificity training, which includes the taper and the race, and 2 weeks of rebuild reset. This outlines a very gradual CTL growth. And as you can see, the slope of the CTL growth changes with the block type because we have to consider fatigue accumulation as we go about, as we switch from block to block to block. During a base durability block, we can take on more fatigue, we can accumulate more fatigue because we don't have to worry as much about training quality. But as we go into the more intense blocks, we have to be careful about how we lay out training stress because we do have to account for the accumulation of fatigue because we need to ensure quality of workout. And also, the taper dip during a specificity block, we're typically done building fitness for the most part. And during that time, we are all about developing the fitness that we have in as race specific a way as possible. So to that end, we flatten out our fitness growth, and we give a little bit away in order to shed fatigue. So we give a little bit of fitness away in order to gain a lot of access to the fitness. This is a standard approach, and it's fine, but it can be limited. And the reason why it can be limited is because it operates under the assumption that initially we need to build a foundation to our training, to our fitness. And with that, it moves into the assumption that we are going to be in an anaerobic state, that our critical intensity, critical power, critical speed is going to be occurring at a low percentage of our speed or power at VO2 max. And we're going to need to push that up. And that occurs during the build threshold block. It then assumes that at the end of the build threshold block, the critical power or critical speed is at a high percentage of power or speed at VO2 max, in which case we now need to raise that roof to separate those two. And so we enter into a VO2 max block. This is the limitation in that it makes this assumption throughout. And that's not necessarily always the case with individual athletes. Individual athletes are more nuanced with that than that. And so with their nuances requires a different approach to training. And so we utilize a special framework that is built around the critical power, critical speed testing or check-in in order to, one, make sure that we are training at the proper intensities, but then also when we know an athlete's critical power, critical speed, and their power or speed at VO2 max, we can see how those two numbers relate to one another in order to understand their physiological state and understand what their greatest need is. Because at the end of the day, our biggest goal is to maximize the return on investment for an athlete. We want to give the athlete as much of what they need and less of what they don't necessarily need. And too many training programs oftentimes try to hit everything. And a lot of those times, there are resources being spent trying to train energy systems that don't need development, when there are other energy systems that could use a lot of development but aren't getting those resources because we're using such a broad brush approach. So the QT 2.0 block periodization model aims to target the athlete's specific needs. And and so the testing represents decision checkpoints for us. We try to do that every 4 to 8 weeks, depending upon the block length. And it helps us to track adaptation, but also physiological state. This allows us to set appropriate training zones and intensities, and like I said, provide a window into current physiological state. So we have, and so I'm going to go through quickly the decision-making framework. We have the practical training blocks, the base durability, specificity, rebuild, reset, and then we have the physiological block types, which are the build threshold lengthening, VO2 max, and hybrid. This is our decision-making framework, written out in words. It's very dense, and so I went through this in the last presentation. I'll skip this and go to the the easier to follow flow chart. And this is how we make our decisions. This is essentially a function, and we have our inputs, and we go through the process of making a decision based upon our inputs, and we get an output, and then the coach decides, okay, now that I have this recommendation of what kind of block type the athlete should be training at with, what are there any contextual nuances that may change this information? Okay, and then the coach makes a decision from there. But this is a basis upon which to make a decision, and then any decision other than the output can be justified through any level of means, depending upon, like I said, the contextual nuance for the athlete. So first off, we do our testing, critical power, critical speed, to understand our current physiological state. Is the athlete in an aerobic state, physiological state, a balanced physiological state, or an anaerobic physiological state? We take that information, we put it over here on the side, and then we go to number two. Are any of these true? And if any of these are true and we make the decision to go with them, then the decision-making process stops there. Okay. And this is different. We do this both for each the bike and the run. They are separate. We treat them separately. Just because you may be in one physiological state on the bike does not mean you will be in the same necessarily be in the same physiological state on the run. So are any of these true? The athlete is in the very early stages of a new macro cycle. If yes, we consider a base durability block. Is the athlete within 6 weeks of their key race or event? If yes, we consider a specificity block. Is the athlete struggling with or rehabbing from an injury? If yes, we consider a base durability block. If we choose not to go with any of these, then we move down to number three, okay, where we grab our physiological state from the side that we tested out earlier, and we determine, okay, which physiological state are they in? If they're in an anaerobic state, meaning that their critical power is occurring at a low percentage of power at VO2 max, then it's pretty easy. We want to increase that ceiling towards the roof, and we go into a build threshold block. That's an easy one. If the athlete is in an aerobic state, meaning their critical power, critical speed occurs at a very high percentage of power or speed at VO2 max, then we have two decision points. One, can they handle high intensity? If the answer to that is yes, and what that means is structurally, will doing good old fashioned speed work put them at risk of injury because the risk profile goes up with such high intensity. So if the answer to that is yes, and we believe that they will benefit from that high intensity. There are some athletes who, no matter whose physiology is so squeezed out that no matter how much high intensity you throw at them, it's just going to bounce off of them. So, can they handle it? Will they benefit from it? And they making sure they didn't just complete a VO2 max block. We never do two in a row. Okay. If all of those things are true, then we consider a VO2 max block. If they cannot handle high intensity, structurally, or it is unlikely that they'll benefit from it, or they just completed a VO2 max block, then we consider the build threshold lengthening block, and that is that. So the VO2 max block, sorry, aims to take the critical power. I'm sorry, the power or speed at VO2 max and raise that up to give space for growth of the critical intensity. Okay, if we don't see a pathway to be able to raise that up, primarily for structural reasons or physiological reasons, then we may work at sub-threshold intensities in order to build out time to exhaustion, build out the length of time that the athlete can maintain those kinds of intensities. And we call that build threshold lengthening. It's similar to the build threshold block, except the intent is not to raise that critical power or critical speed, it's to build out its robustness. Yeah. Lastly, if the athlete is in a balanced physiological state, then we have three considerations. Are you concerned about the race day durability of the athlete? If yes, consider a base durability block. Are you concerned about the race day pacing execution of an athlete? If yes, consider a specificity block. If you're not concerned about either of those, then you may consider a hybrid block, which does a little bit of threshold work, a little bit of VO2 max work, and a little bit of specificity work. And in that way, tries to build out the entire um, uh, structure of the athlete, raising their critical intensity as well as their VO2 max at the same rate because they already operate at a kind of a balanced state. So we want to maintain that balance. And at the same time, we're building out the athlete's ability to hit and maintain and execute upon race intensity. That's the decision making framework. That's we use the testing to inform this decision. And the testing really isn't about understanding, it's not necessarily about tracking improvement and stuff like that. It's mainly that's a nice side benefit, but it's mainly about understanding the intensity that the athlete needs to be training at in order to ensure that we are training the proper energy systems, but also two, to make sure to understand the athlete's physiological state so that we can then train that physiological state as appropriately and efficiently as possible. So that's the framework. It gives an output. The coach then decides what to do with that output. Now I'll get to the real meat of what we wanted to talk about today, which was how do we apply this to real athletes? Okay, so each of the examples that I'll go through are real athletes. So this is athlete TS, not me. Is a cyclist. He's brand new to cycling, has never cycled before, was an ultra runner, and one day decided that he wanted to do Unbound in 2026. So gave me a call and said, "Hey, I really want to do this cycling race. I've never trained on a bike whatsoever." We said, "All right, let's give this a try." So started cycle training for the first time in early June 2025. And he was his CTL, his cycling CTL was zero. He'd never been on a bike before, never been training on a bike before. So we did some initial testing in mid-June, right after he got started. We needed to get him on the bike first. And it came back with a 3-minute wattage of 330, 6-minute 270, 12-minute 247 for a critical power of 217 and a critical power to VO2 max ratio of 65.7, which suggests a very, very anaerobic state, meaning with the physiological attic space is large. Okay. That said, because he was so new to cycling, we went, we did, we he checked this box with absolute certainty, right? He was in the very early stages of a new macrocycle. He was in very early stages of a new sport. So we went with a base durability block of 10 weeks. A little longer than I would normally go. I usually like to go 6 to 8 weeks, but he was so new to cycling that I just wanted to extend that out and build up some level of CTL over time. In doing so, we had to ignore this. But again, that's part of this process, right? We understand the physiological state, and then we take that information, we put it to the side, okay, and we go through and we make a we consider the athlete from the practical standpoint and whether or not there are any pressing practical needs. And in this case, there was. Had there not been, then we would have come down to number three and definitely been here, right? But there were. Um, okay, so. Then, in late July, after 10 weeks of base durability work, I think it was 10 weeks, he did another test 3 minute at 351, so a 21 watt growth there. 6 minute of 292, 22 watt growth, and then a 12 minute of 258, 11 watt growth for a new critical power of 229 watts and a critical power VO2 max ratio of 65.2. Now, as you can see, everything grew. So we did an extended base durability block, and the whole house grew in size. So the foundation grew out, the critical power went up, but also the power at VO2 max went up at the same rate. Okay, so we have the same house, just larger. Okay, but all the dimensions are essentially the same. All the dimensions are proportional to the earlier house. Okay, um, and so that was pretty cool, and it was really easy to make that decision because it's very clear that what he needed was a build threshold block. We need to raise that ceiling, but we could feel comfortable in doing so because he developed a base fitness. To look at his CTL curve, okay, we see. We started at 0 for a CTL, and we built up to 27 in 10 weeks. Intensity was very low because the base durability block, so we didn't have to worry about fatigue or anything like that. And we just pushed, 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 pushed. Using a stress logic framework, which I'll speak to in a future presentation, that allowed us to apply the most training stress as was appropriate on a week-to-week basis, without necessarily having built out uh, uh, a standard traditional periodization program of build, 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 recover, build, 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 recover. Instead, we said, okay, what is the most amount of training stress that I can apply to this athlete this week, and using several different factors. And I'll speak to that in the future. So we have this very steep CTL curve, all right. And during that time, we had a 5.2% increase in critical power and a 6.4% increase in power at VO2 max. And then we shifted over into a build threshold block. Um, and we see that the CTL curve, the slope of the fitness growth comes down a little bit. It slows down. And the reason for that is because we just have to be careful of accumulating fatigue because the intensity during this block goes up so much relative to the base durability block. So we have to ensure quality. Otherwise, if we don't ensure quality and protect quality of the workouts, there's really no use in doing the build threshold block in the first place. Okay. Um, Okay, so that is where he stands, and we have some testing coming up in the next week or so, maybe 2 weeks, and we'll see what we've developed. My expectation is that we'll probably see some growth in the critical power up towards. We'll see some growth in this number, okay, and we'll see some growth in this number, and we'll probably see power at VO2 max stay relatively stable, or even diminish a little bit, which can be the case. All right, next up we have an athlete, ED. She's a triathlete. I'm going to talk about the bike right now. She started training with QT 2.0 in mid-July of 2025, had just rehabbed through double stress fractures. She had a decent base on the bike, though her rehab required her to track and spend a lot of time focused on how much time she was on her feet. She had to be really careful about applying too much stress of any kind. That said, she was able to get a little bit of biking in, much more so than running. Target race for 2026 is Ironman Lake Placid. So in mid-July, initial testing results were 3 minute 309, 6 minute 266, 12 minute 253. Came back with a critical power of 235 watts, critical power to VO2 max ratio of 76%, which would put her in an anaerobic state. But if we go back to our decision-making framework, we understood that she was in an anaerobic state. We put that to the side. Now we go through here. Was it what were we in the early stages of a new macro cycle? Yeah. Did she have a base? I would say she had a base. My default would have probably put her here. But this was probably my primary reason. We went with a base durability block primarily for this reason. Okay. And so the answer that came out of this decision framework was base durability, and therefore we never considered the physiological. Um, Okay, so we did that for 7 weeks, and really, I just wanted to err on the side of caution, make sure we're on the same page, make sure we had training intensities right. I didn't want to be wrong because she had been so sidelined before coming to us with this double stress fracture. So I didn't need to be right. I just didn't want to be wrong. So we went with the base durability block for 7 weeks. And I knew that it wasn't necessarily the lowest hanging fruit with because she had a decentish base, but like I said, it wasn't the wrong answer. So then we tested again in early September. A little bit of growth in the Power Up VO2 Max, a little bit of growth in the 6 minute, and a little bit of growth in the 12 minute gave us 8 watts on our critical power and a critical power to VO2 max ratio of 77.1. That's 8 watt improvement on a base that was already relatively well developed. But that said, now as we go to the decision making framework, this gave me this information. She was in an anaerobic state with her critical power to power VO2 max ratio of 77.1. And this no longer applied. This wasn't going to apply because we're talking about Ironman Lake Placid in 2026. And we felt confident that we could move on from the rehabbing. So we came down to number three. She's in an anaerobic state. We went with a build threshold block. And this is what her training had looked like on the bike. So we had this period of extended time with a base training block, a base durability block. During that time, we got a 3.4% increase in critical power and a just under 2% increase in power at VO2 max. We are now in a build threshold block. And like I said with TS earlier, we see that the slope of growth decreases because we are in that build threshold block. And what we are really trying to do, because we have to protect quality, and what we are really trying to do is raise this number. Okay, we are trying to push this critical power number closer towards this 315. Okay, we're trying to raise that ceiling. So that's our goal, and we'll have some testing in the next few weeks. Same athlete on the run. The run was much more I was much more nervous on the run because of the nature of the injuries. She was just getting back into regular running. She was okayed to do a run test in mid-July. So she performed a run test. It came back, critical speed came back at 727 with critical speed to VO2 max ratio of 85.5, which would put her in a balanced state at that time. Okay, that is a balanced state. Now, just to go back to the decision making framework, here we are. Her physiological state in mid July was balanced. Put that to the side. Here we are. Yes, we are in the very early stages of coming back to training. So yes, that's a big yes on the base durability block. Also, she's rehabbing a serious injury to a serious running injury. Big yes on the base durability block. We didn't even consider her physiological state. We went with base durability block and left the decision making framework behind. Well, we utilized it. Okay, so now she goes through a full 9 weeks of base durability. She and I had it. We felt comfortable to test again. So she tested in early September. So 400 time, 124, 800 time, 312, and then a nice big improvement on her 2 mile time of 1359 gave us a critical speed of 714, with critical speed occurring at 89% of speed at VO2 max, which puts her in an aerobic state. Okay. Now, we had a, so let's go to our decision making framework over here, right? So she's in an aerobic state. We have a discussion. This is no longer an issue. We have a discussion about the safety of things, okay, and whether or not we feel safe enough to leave a base durability block based upon the injury situation. She and I agreed that we were okay there. So we came here to the aerobic. Okay, we pulled out our physiological state and we considered it. And we went through and the question was, can she handle the high intensity? And I don't know that she couldn't, right? But I didn't, I was really afraid to say that she could. And so at that point, it just wasn't worth the risk, right? While even though I believe that she would definitely benefit from it, and we weren't coming off of a VO2 max block, this just wasn't worth the risk with the data that we had so far. And so we opted away from a VO2 max block, and we went to a build threshold block, which is still going to build out, it's still hitting the needs of the aerobic athlete, but it with less risk, right? And and so we are building out the robustness of her sub-threshold intensities. That is our aim right now. Now, if she tests again in some weeks and she comes back aerobic, she and I will have another discussion around whether or not we think that we could try the VO2 max block, but I would have more belief, more trust that she could handle the intensity of the VO2 max block. But at the time, I just wasn't prepared to go there. On the CTL basis, we did an extended base durability block because of the injury. We shifted into a build threshold lengthening block. During the base durability block, we got a 3% improvement in critical speed and a 1% decrease in speed at VO2 max. That can often happen because we were focused on something else. All right. Now, athlete EB, who's a triathlete, was going to look at the bike right now. Started training with QT 2.0 in early June of 2025. Had an upcoming 70.3 in mid-July. So, testing results on the bike late May came to me, and um, 3 minute 329, 6 minute 270, 12 minute 254. Critical power is 230 watts. Critical power to VO2 max ratio is 70%, highly anaerobic. But because we are if we look at our decision-making framework, so she comes in at anaerobic, we put that to the side, and then we say, are any of these true? So she wasn't new to a new macro cycle. And I wasn't worried about an injury that was specific to the bike, though I'll come back to that. Um, but we did have a race coming up in the next 6 weeks, so we jumped right into specificity. We ignored the anaerobic nature of her physiology at that time. Hold on, let me get back to where I was. Okay, so now we probably she had so she went through a specificity block of training, and we were continuing with running in a base durability way, which I'll speak to in a bit because she had a little bit of an injury propensity and risk, though it was behaving and but kind of misbehaving. So we were just kind of being careful. And then right around the race time frame in mid-July, we had a little bit of we thought we had a step back with regards to the injury, and we kind of got distracted from things. So we probably should have tested in mid-July, but we didn't. That said, um, the critical power to VO2 max ratio from May was so low, was so anaerobic that it was pretty clear that the right move was probably going to be to go into a build threshold block. Okay. So we did that. And actually, let me just confirm yeah, we did that. We went into a build threshold block, and for a number of weeks, and then we retested in late August. So we did specificity through July and August. Okay, and we retested and we lost a little bit on the power VO2 max. We gained the 6 minute wattage, and we gained a little bit on the 12 minute, but we our critical power, because of how all of those numbers relate to one another, okay, increased by 11 watts, 241 watts. And her critical power to VO2 max ratio rose. It closed a little bit of the physiological attic space. Okay. So we gained a lot on the critical power side of things through that training block. Now, at the end of after that 6 weeks of build threshold work, she was entering into another race phase, and so we went back into a specificity block, which I'll outline right here. So this CTL curve has a lot of practicality built into it. Actually, yeah, there's a lot of practicality written into this CTL curve. And so we see that very early on, right away, we went into a specificity block because of the upcoming race, right? And then we made the more uh, physiological decision to go to a build threshold block because we had some time in between before the next race. Um, and and then we going back into a race block, so we went back to specificity. Okay. During this time frame right here, all right, during the specificity and the build threshold, and remember, specificity is not a time when we really get to build fitness. It's when we're trying to utilize the fitness in as race specific a way as possible. So typically speaking, it's a relatively flat time from a CTL perspective. We got CTL growth during this time. Quite frankly, the stuff that was being given to her from a training perspective prior to working with us was trash. Um, I don't like to say that, but it just was. And so she actually got some fitness growth during a time when it should have been a consolidation period. Um, anyway, we got about 4.8% increase in critical power during this period of time, and a little bit of loss in power VO2 max, but that closed that ratio. Okay. So now this specificity block looks more from a CTL perspective, looks more like a specificity block would should look versus this initial period. Okay, same athlete on the run. This was when she started with us in early June. This was when a little bit of stress reaction was poking its head. It was it was giving us some shots over the bow. It was telling us that it could be a problem, but it didn't have to be. And she had the upcoming race in mid-July, but with the lower leg stress reactions, we took care. So we to go to our decision making framework here, we knew that she had done some testing, and I forgot what the testing result was just off the top of my head. So she did some testing, and critical speed was at 718. The critical speed of the VO2 max was 81.6, which is aerobic. It's pushing towards balance, but I'm sorry, anaerobic. Um, it's pushing towards balance, but it is anaerobic. And so that was the physiological state that she was in. And we came and we said, okay, so we take the anaerobic nature, we put it to the side. Is the athlete in the very early stages of a new macro cycle? No. Is the athlete within 6 weeks of their key race or event? Yes. We could consider a specificity block. Is the athlete struggling with or rehabbing an injury? And the answer to this was not no. Okay, so we had a little bit of a battle between these two. The battle that existed between these two pretty much told me that we weren't going to get to the physiological consideration. We either had to think about things from a specificity standpoint or from a base durability standpoint. And to erring on the side of caution, we ended up going with a base durability block of training. Let me just get back. And so that's what we did for an very, very extended period of time. We were able to run in a really long base durability block. We continue running without the injury worsening. Okay, it would be there, but it wasn't getting any worse. It wasn't necessarily getting any better either. So and this athlete wanted to train. Just it was I'm going to train. So we needed to make sure that we were very careful about what we did here and didn't put any undue stress on that injury area so to exacerbate it in any way. Um, so we did find that we could utilize a base durability block and not worsen things. Um, Now, it was a long base durability block, and we probably kind of squeezed all the training adaptation that out of it that we were going to get because we weren't really able to increase training stress through duration. We weren't going to increase training stress through intensity. So we were just kind of like staying consistent in a holding pattern. Okay, we weren't losing anything, but we probably weren't gaining anything either. And then we decided towards the end of August that we would let's we have with the new race upcoming races coming up, we could try to play out and see if we could do some specificity block. And what has happened with that is um, it hasn't it's been going okay, but the injury is showing its head in a little more aggressive way than it had been in the past. We believe with imaging that we're okay to get through the races, and then we're gonna formally shut it down for a few weeks and let this thing just go away. But the imaging is showing that the injury is increasing, but not at a rate that we need to be concerned about. But it just goes to show that the added intensity is the body is recognizing the added intensity and it's threatening us a little bit. So this is the layout. This is a very practical approach. So this is when we started working together, base durability blocks through that initial race period where we had a little bit of a scare, which actually turned out to be nothing. But we had a little bit of uh-oh, and we didn't run. We lost a little bit of CTL. When we came back, we went back to a base durability block, and that allowed us. It really allowed us to be consistent and build back fitness some. And now recently we've been entering into a specificity block along with a little bit of a taper, not a little bit of taper, a solid taper into these upcoming races in the next week or so. Um, so that's why we have that negative CTL there. And the negative CTL is because we're shedding fatigue and we're also very aggressively erring on the side of caution. If we're in doubt, we don't run, right? So this has been it's worked, right? The base durability block has actually allowed us to continue running without feeling too afraid of worrying about worsening the injury. Uh, so that's that. As always, if you have any questions, feel free to reach out. You can find us at www.qt2systems.com. Email us at services@qt2systems.com. Check us out on any of the social medias. Thank you.